yacht. Then he got her tied up in a proper sailor's knot. Then he kissed her twice, the dirty dog, upon her beauty spot. Oh, I never cried so much in all my life. She lingered near the Rose and Crown. The wind was howling wild. When up the village street there came the father of her child. She wasn't married. He was. So she tapped him for a tanner for a pint of Olden Mile. Oh, I never cried so much in all my life.
When Gracie Fields died, she was buried in Capri, her adoptive home, and beside her grave there's a small memorial tablet that says simply, Our Gracie. And that's exactly what she was. She was Our Gracie, Britain's Gracie, a national institution. It's astonishing, really, because she spent nearly half her 81 years living abroad, and for a while she was vilified in the press as a traitress. Well, today I suppose she's best remembered for 3 songs, Sally, Walter, and the biggest aspidistra in the world, none of which is particularly distinguished and none of which she particularly liked. But she was a singer of remarkable range. At one time, she was said to be earning a higher salary than anyone else in the world, and in the 1930s, the position she occupied in the public affection was second only to that of the King and Queen. Now, the story of this amazing woman begins here in Rochdale on January the 9th, 1898, when she was born above her granny's chip shop in Molesworth Street. Her name then was Grace Stansfield. She was the first of 4 children born to Fred Stansfield, an unskilled labourer, and his wife Jenny. And the fact that from these unlikely and penurious circumstances, Grace Stansfield went on to become Dame Gracie Fields, millionairess, international star, and a kind of public monument, was due almost entirely to the drive and thwarted theatrical ambitions of her mother, Jenny.
Because she couldn't go on the stage, she meant to, you know, sort of work it out through her children, which she did. She pushed them all on the stage, you know, one after the other. But Grace, of course, had more talent than anybody else, and Grace was the one she concentrated on. But she had a great influence on Grace, and Grace had great respect for her mother and was slightly afraid of her. You know, she used to really frighten the life out of her at times when she was a child.
As a child, she was the only one, because we didn't have any money in those days, that was allowed to go to the gallery at the old Hippodrome in Rochdale and watch the show. And when she came back, she had to give us, all of us, an idea of what the people were doing, and she became a very good mimic.
Gracie Fields' stage career began at the age of 7 when she won a talent contest at the Rochdale Hippodrome. She then left school after a formal education that had lasted for 1 year, and at her mother's instigation appeared with a number of juvenile touring companies. It can't have been an altogether easy life, because at 13 she suffered a nervous breakdown and an attack of St. Vitus dance and retired from show business to become a cotton winder in the mill. But in 1912, aged 14, she began her comeback and joined a troupe called Charburn's Young Stars, in which company she taught herself to read and discovered a natural talent for comedy.
Because she had such a good voice, she always used to go better than the others. Well, the man who owned the particular company or troupe, he decided he was going to give her the worst song to sing so that the others got a chance. Well, this infuriated Grace, you see, and after a certain time she got fed up with this. So she said, right, I'm going to burlesque this song, which was a sad song. And of course, next minute she had the people in stitches because she was pulling faces and all sorts of things, and it was terribly funny. Mind you, her boss was absolutely furious. He said, you're not supposed to do this at all. You've disobeyed me, but you better do it again, because it went well.
Well, she used to tour, you know, very small, very rough places in the beginning. She had quite a tough time in these little small shows. And there was one person in the show that was, I think she was billed over Gracie in those days. I think she was top billing. And Gracie used to do these very good, she was a wonderful impersonator. And when she came off stage one night, she said to her, well, of course, anybody can earn a living, she said, doing other people's work and imitating other people. That's very easy. People could squash Gracie very easily, and she never did another impression from that night on.
In 1914, and in a review called Yes, I Think So, Grace Stansfield, now professionally known as Gracie Fields, met a Cockney comedian named Archie Pitt. He wasn't much of a comedian, but he did have a sharp eye for talent, and spotting it immediately in the young Gracie, he persuaded her to join him in a review of his own called It's a Bargain. She didn't actually like him a great deal, but egged on by her mother, who approved of anyone who approved of Gracie, She agreed to go with him, and Archie Pitt took over the task of promoting her career.
Archie Pitt definitely developed her talent. He didn't give her talent, nobody could have given her that. But Archie wrote wonderful sketches and scripts for her, and if she'd been with an ordinary comedian, as she came off, he would have said to her, listen, do that again and I'll walk off the stage. But Archie would cut anything from anybody. This had to be cut from that one, that from the other one, to keep anything in that Gracie did. And this gave her great confidence and definitely built her.
Gracie spent 2 years touring in It's a Bargain and then 6 more years in another revue, Mr. Tower of London, during which time both she and the show became increasingly successful. In 1923, and in the 5th year of this tour, Archie Pitt decided to protect his investment by marrying her. He was 43, and as she said later, a passable imitation of Svengali, and Gracie, an unsophisticated 25, was ideally cast as Trilby.
It was more of a business marriage as far as he was concerned. I don't think he ever really loved Grace, and certainly she didn't love him. But, I mean, this was a case of where my mother's predominant character came back into the picture because she could see the potential that Grace could have with this man, and she's persuaded Grace, really, to sort of marry him from that angle. And, of course, I mean, let's face it, Grace never looked back from then on. So, I mean, she's got a lot to thank Archie Pitt for as a professional manager and artist, but as a husband, no.
With regard to Annie Lipman, who Archie was always friendly with, Gracie knew about this. She was the conductress of the show, and she knew about this at the time they got married. And Gracie was never a wife in the accepted sense of a wife. She couldn't be bothered.
She had her work. And, of course, that alleviated all the sort of the tensions and miseries that she had in other directions.
18 months after the wedding, which Archie Pitt never allowed to interfere with his relationship with his mistress, one Annie Lipman, Mr. Tower of London moved into the Alhambra Theatre and was an immediate hit. Gracie Fields, the new West End star, started to make records and for a while appeared in 2 theatres at once, playing the straight role of Lady Weir opposite Sir Gerald du Maurier in the play SOS, and then nipping across the road to do her stuff at the Alhambra. What's more, lest anyone should accuse her of idleness, she would often finish the night with a cabaret stint at the Café de Paris. Well, with all the money that was thus rolling in, Archie Pitt built an enormous mansion called the Towers in Hampstead, and more altruistically helped his wife to found the Gracie Fields orphanage at Brighton. Meanwhile, the source of all this wealth, Gracie herself, seemed quite unaffected either by her riches or by her fame.
Grace is the most unusual person, unorthodox in our business, I would say. I don't think she ever realised how really popular she was. I mean, she loved people, she always has done, but she was still one of them. And all the success and everything appertaining to it was, all right, was part of her work, but it didn't mean any more than that.
In the early 1930s, with her marriage to Archie Pitt rapidly disintegrating, Gracie bought this house in Brighton for her parents. It became a gathering place for the whole Stansfield family clan, and especially at weekends when she came down to escape the rigours and pressures of her life in London, it was the closest thing to a home that Gracie herself had. The Towers, that 28-room mansion in Hampstead that Archie Pitt had built, had been more or less taken over by his mistress, Annie Lipman. And so Gracie found herself in a predicament that's by no means uncommon in the annals of show business. Her professional life could hardly have been more successful, her private life could hardly have been less so. And it was at this point, this decidedly low point, that her sister Betty introduced her to John Flanagan, an Irishman, a painter of modest accomplishment, who was to become the first man and possibly the only man with whom Gracie fell quite passionately in love.
They had a tremendous amount of affection for each other, but of course he knew nothing at all about the theatre. And I'm afraid Grace spoiled him.
I think John was very fond of her, but he couldn't accept the... John couldn't accept the glamour and everything that went with it, and the fact that she was in a position to pay for things for him and that sort of thing. I don't think he could accept that at all. He didn't want it.
He said, well, he said, I go around and I flog a picture, and he said, I get about 35 to 40 pounds for it. He said, she comes home with £2,000 or £3,000 and chucks it on the bed.
Meanwhile, still acting on his own and Gracie's behalf, Archie Pitt started her off on what was to become an extremely lucrative, if not entirely satisfactory, film career. Her first picture in 1931, when she was 33, was a low-budget quickie called Sally in Our Alley, in which she sang what was henceforth to become her theme song.
Sally, Sally, don't ever wander away from the alley and me. Sally, Sally, marry me, Sally, and happy forever I'll be.
Just before her marriage to Archie Pitt finally broke up, Gracie paid her first visit to Capri in the company of John Flanagan and a mutual friend. And she fell in love with the place immediately, which was unusual for her because, on her own admission, she was normally homesick for Rochdale, even when she was only in London. But within a year or so of that initial visit, she'd bought herself a property here at Marina Piccola, on the south of the island. It cost her just about everything she had, or at least everything she had, bar £25. In the first place, I suppose, she regarded Capri as a potential holiday home for herself and Flanagan, but Flanagan, alas, was soon to disappear from her life. He'd never been able to cope with or even fully to understand her immense popularity, and he was made uneasy by her equally immense income. In every way, perhaps, Gracie was just too rich for him. But with or without Flanagan, Capri continued to hold its enchantment for her. And for the rest of her life, this is where she came to escape from pressure, to recuperate from illness, and for the last 30 years, to live.
She didn't like films, she didn't like film work. She used to feel very shut up and closed in, and it used to drive her mad because so many people, she was what we used to call a one-take Joe, you know. I mean, whatever she had to do, she did, and that first take was great. But sometimes she'd say to me, oh, I'm going to go mad on this film. We've got 20-take Charlies and you know, 30-take Freds and people that you keep on doing the same old line over and over and over again. And I think she got very bored with them.
Well, I'm trying to tell you, but you won't listen. You see, I was Nell Gwynn.
You were who?
Nell Gwynn, and my father was King Charles II.
Surely not.
No, not really. I mean on the float.
But you've already said you were not afloat. How could your father be King Charles II? He died in 1685.
No, he didn't. He's here in the court.
Oh! Take this woman away and have her certified.
I was done when I was a child, and it didn't take.
They never quite got her character. She was playing a part, but playing Gracie Fields in a part. You know what I mean? Gracie Fields thing always came through.
I don't think she ever really made what I would call a good film.
Do you think she felt that too?
Yes, I do, yes. She couldn't really sort of get over so much with films. There was a sort of tightening up of her.
In the illogical way of the film industry, Gracie Fields' reluctance to make movies meant that producers chased her ever more ardently and waved increasingly fat checks at her. By the mid-1930s, she was the biggest female draw in British cinemas, but her pictures were all pretty much the same, a mixture of slapstick comedy and love songs, with Gracie the clown losing her man to the ingenue in the last reel. Most of them were directed by Basil Dean, a respected filmmaker whose appreciation of Gracie was somewhat hampered by the fact that he had very little sense of humour. He did, however, team her successfully with John Loder.
Basil Dean then put me under contract and had the bright idea of casting me opposite Gracie, because he thought that having a mill girl playing opposite an old Etonian, if you will pardon the expression, would be a lot of fun, and it was. It turned out that the public liked it, and we did, I think, 4 pictures together.
Oi, what's the idea? Can I tell you not to cut across?
That's right, Sergeant.
Where's your license?
Oh, that's got him. Take him away. Take him away. Have him shot.
Sorry, sir. All right, 13. Clear him away. Why didn't you say so before, sir?
Well, I lie that. See that? One law for the rich and another for the poor.
You better keep to your own century, Nellie Gwynn.
You be careful where you're going or you'll be knocked into the next century. Why, never mind. We'll keep a bed for you.
I was sitting next to Gracie and we were setting up for the next shot. And Gracie said to me, John, how can I be funny with old Basil looking at me all the time? So I said, Gracie, you know, I've just done a picture with a fellow called Monty Banks, and he kept everybody in stitches of laughter. So he said, bring him down to P7 for lunch next Sunday. And I did. And they did the next picture together. He directed, and I played Annie called Queen of Hearts.
Hold me while I sing my first love song. Let me live once again through the happy refrain. Let me sing my first love song.
By now, Hollywood was courting Gracie Fields, even though the London boss of MGM had once compared her rather shrewdly with America's favourite cracker-barrel philosopher and comedian Will Rogers. Each of them, he said, has a brand of humour that is strictly national, and by that, of course, he meant that it didn't necessarily travel. Gracie, too, had her qualms about Hollywood. I've always been afraid, she said, that they might make me sort of half and half, and they might not use the right halves either. Nevertheless, Darryl Zanuck here at 20th Century Fox was able to attract her attention with an offer of £200,000 for 4 films. And that was even more than Mae West was getting, and at that time, Mae West was the highest paid actress in America. Gracie's was the highest salary ever paid to a human being, said the publicity. Well, no doubt it lied in its teeth. But even so, £200,000 was a very considerable sum of money, especially in those days. And Gracie was in rather urgent need of money because she'd just been faced with a whacking great tax bill from the Inland Revenue. Thus, she duly came to Hollywood. Thoughtfully, though, she'd had inserted in her contract a clause to the effect that all her films for Fox were to be made in England. So her trip to California was basically for the purposes of publicity and for what Hollywood regarded as the necessary process of grooming and glamorizing.
Well, I've had a very wonderful time while I've been out here. I shall be very, very sorry to leave. Still, I've got to get back home for the coronation. I can't miss that, lads.
It didn't change her personality at all, really. She came back here and gagged about it, you know, that they've groomed me, but I'm still the same thing, and looking very glamorous, just went back to normal, threw away her fur coat and her glad rags and got on with the job of being exactly as she always was.
The freedom of her native town for Gracie. Miss Fields, just back from her visit to Hollywood, is honoured by Rochdale, or to adopt her own expression, is given the first prize.
Gracie's parents were there that day in 1938, gratifyingly because, as Gracie said later, everything she had done was to please her mother. Mrs. Stansfield must have been very pleased that year because her daughter was also awarded the CBE. And all this official recognition, fairly rare for a performer in those days, owed much to the fact that Gracie Fields had done more than anybody else to keep Britain moderately cheerful during the Depression years.
Glad when it was all over. My knees were knocking. Still, I think we're going to have a cup of coffee now. It's a bit cold. Good night, boys.
She was a great image in my life as a tiny child. And as I grew older, of course, one of the reasons historically one understands is because of the Depression and that peculiar, wonderful personality that she had, the way that she radiated being ordinary. I mean, in the good sense of the term. I mean, she was a good sort. So I think she climbed into all our lives as youngsters in my generation immediately.
Literally speaking, although the public were not aware of it, neither was she. She hypnotized them. They were hypnotized by this colossal personality, and if there was umpteen people on the stage, they could only look at Gracie Fields.
She could have an audience crying and a pin dropping, and the next moment screaming their heads off.
She was two completely different characters. Off the stage, she was a normal, you know, easygoing person, worked hard, was dreaming about her work all the time. But when she got on the stage, she was a completely different person. She was sort of lifted in some peculiar way. And she knew this, she felt this, and used to get worried about it.
She didn't act like a famous person in any way at all. I mean, to my way, I think Gracie, in a way, led a sad life because she could have had so much. And I always used to think she had everything and yet had nothing because she sort of used to almost apologise for living.
She was always very shy of people she thought were bigger than she was. It was funny, she never thought she should ever call Evelyn Leigh Evelyn. She said, oh, she was a big star, and she always thought of her as Miss Leigh.
Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Not a tear, but a cheer, make it gay. Give me a smile I can keep all the while in my heart while I'm away. Till we meet once again, you and I. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way. Wish me luck.
Shipyard Sally was her third film under the Fox contract, and all of them were directed by the Italian-born Monty Banks, who, as the gossip writers used to put it rather delicately, had become her constant companion. Gracie Fields was now at the peak of her popularity. Her records were bestsellers, her stage appearances were to standing room only, and when she broadcast on the radio, people cancelled all other engagements. But at this point, she became dangerously ill with cancer of the cervix. There were only two options open to her, neither of them particularly attractive.
It was a very hard decision to make because it wasn't really a 50-50 chance. It was a case that if she didn't have the operation, she would die within about 7 months. And if she had the operation, as I say, it wasn't quite a 50-50 chance. Anyhow, we decided to take a chance on that, and thank God we did.
The operation was performed at the Chelsea Hospital for Women in London. The public anxiety for her, illustrated by Stroob's cartoon in the Daily Express with the simple caption, "Our Gracie," was quite extraordinary.
I don't think it's ever been heard of before in history, where you get a whole country who are praying in church for her life. Such was the love of this person that everybody felt as though she, she was part of their lives.
When Gracie left hospital, she was advised to rest for 2 years, but she did immediately thank her public in a radio broadcast, always a notable event. On one such occasion, an entry in Hansard read, "Gracie Fields is on the air tonight. It is obvious that the debate must end at an early hour." Then, in July 1939, doubtless anxious not to disrupt Parliament any further, she went to Capri with Monty Banks and Mary Davey to convalesce. This respite, however, was not to last long.
She was feeling so, the war is going to start and people were getting worried. Must get back and do my bit. So we came back 2 days before war started, actually. And right away, although she shouldn't have been working for 2 years, she decided she must go to France and do some concerts for the troops.
We were doing as many as 3 or 4 shows a day with long distances between. We went on to bomb sites and perhaps sometimes only a couple of dozen soldiers, and Gracie would do it, with that lovely voice and that friendliness that she had, and a very sick woman she was. She once or twice did things where and in those days, I'm not too bad now for a geriatric, but in those days I was really going, and they'd say, will you do another one? And perhaps we'd done 4, and I'd say, oh, I think I'd just like to put my feet up a bit. Grace said, I'll go along, it's all right, and she went.
On this tour, Gracie and Arthur Askey were invited to meet Maurice Chevalier. No big deal for her, one would have thought, but starstruck as ever, she was thrown into confusion by the prospect and decided it was absolutely essential that she bought a new hat.
She tried a couple of hats. How's that one, love? All right, you like it? Yes. So eventually she bought one, but put a headscarf on again and had a brown paper bag, And next door to this shop, there was a jeweller's. And she said, oh, I like the look of that little brooch. The back opened and there was a watch inside, and it had 2 prongs in it. Anyway, she bought it, and she stuck it in the front of her headscarf here. And as we were walking around, she kept opening and said, what's the time, love? We mustn't be late for meeting Boris.
At this stage, Gracie and Monty Banks decided to marry. They did so in California, whither she'd sent her parents at the outbreak of war. Immediately after the wedding, Gracie and Monty returned to England for more Ensa shows, but now Italy came into the war on the wrong side, and Monty Banks, still an Italian citizen, was threatened with internment. Wisely, he decided to forgo this doubtful privilege and nip back across the Atlantic, and Gracie went with him to undertake a Canadian tour on behalf of the Navy League. As soon as she'd gone, the British press began a smear campaign against her, calling her a traitor for abandoning England and accusing her of smuggling her family, her fortune and her jewellery out of the country. Suddenly, the woman everyone had loved was presented as the woman everyone should love to hate, and the fact that the accusations levelled at her were all wildly exaggerated made very little difference, except, of course, to Gracie Fields.
She hated that. It really upset her. She wasn't angry, she was just very upset about it. It was all so wrong. She was married, she was in love with her husband, and it was the obvious thing that she should go away with him.
During the war years, Mr. and Mrs. Banks made their home in Santa Monica in California. Undoubtedly, Gracie was happier with Monty Banks than she had been with Archie Pitt, but this marriage, too, was very much a business arrangement. Banks had been in the film business, both in America and Britain, since the early days of silent pictures, first as a comedian and then as director and producer, and he, too, knew a good investment when he saw one, but at least he was agreeable company.
He was fun. He was a completely different character again. He liked the good life, and when you went out with him, you had a lot of fun. You know, he knew where to go, and everybody recognised him.
The only thing about Monty, of course, he was a terrible gambler. He couldn't stop gambling. He liked to play cards and baccarat and things like that. And he was playing with the big boys in America, you know, Zanuck and all that crowd. And, of course, he didn't have the money for that. So he was certainly using a lot of her money as well.
He left her free to do her work on tour. He'd come and join us every once in a while. But he appreciated her attachment to her work and left her free to do what she wanted.
Throughout the war, Gracie Fields continued to entertain the troops and to raise money for the war effort at charity concerts. Twice she returned to England, and both times, despite the smear campaign, was most warmly received. Perhaps people didn't believe everything they read in the papers.
Now I'm on my way, you stay and hold down the fort. I'll tell the captain our worries are over, we have your support. So pray for me, soldier, and promise each day you'll be a good soldier while your daddy's away. I'm a little on the lonely side. The girl that makes the thing that drills the hole that holds the spring, that makes the thingamabob, that makes the engines roar. And I'm the girl that makes the thing that holds the oil, that oils the ring, that makes the thingamabob that's going to win the war,
I suppose you know about that sailor that landed on a desert island, not a soul in sight. Suddenly a little coloured girl came up from nowhere. She says, British sailor, you like a big steak? He says, what, you got a big steak here? That's marvellous. He says, I'm starving. So he had the steak, then she said, you like some beer? He says, this is not true. She says, yes, I have some beer. He says, pass it on, pass it on. And she came along and says, like a cigarette? He says, blimey. He says, pass it on, pass it on. And she says, you like to come out in the wood and play games? He says, blimey, have they got a dartboard here?
Gracie made 4 films while living in America, among them Holy Matrimony in 1943, in which she played her first straight role opposite Monty Woolley. Altogether, she made 15 pictures, the last 2 of them in 1945, and one of these was Molly and Me, in which she appeared with Roddy McDowall, who was to become a lifelong friend.
There was only one problem. I was something like 15, or going on 16, but I looked younger, but I still looked, you know, a healthy 13, and the role was really for a boy of 8. Gracie told me last year, she had sort of a shock because they'd pre-recorded the numbers and she hadn't seen me. And one of the first things she had to do was, I was rather a lummox, was to sing Christopher Robin is saying his prayers to me, which sort of put her back.
Little boy kneels at the foot of the bed, droops on the little hen's little gold head. Whisper, who dares? Christopher Robin is saying his prayers.
I would never have said she was a great actress, but she acted from here. And that was the important thing. I remember on Paris Underground, there was a scene when she'd been let out of prison. And she and Constance Bennett had been in prison for years. And when she came out, they were appearing in front of the officer who was questioning them. And Constance Bennett, all done up, you know, glamour girl and everything. Grace came out looking here, dirty and everything. And here. Every time I saw that shot on the stage with lights and everything and the workmen all around, it made me cry, because she did it from here.
Oh, thank heaven, Emmy. Emmy, what's the matter? Please, it's Kitty. Oh, Emmy, don't you recognize me? Emmy, please, say you do. It's Kitty, Emmy.
No. Kitty was executed a long time ago.
Oh, no. They told me they'd shot you, too, don't you see? Just to torture us. Emmy, please, it's Kitty. Kitty. It's Kitty. Oh, Emmy, it's Kitty.
By now, the war was over, but the British press campaign against Gracie Fields continued, and it wasn't until 1948, at the age of 50, that she returned to London for her first personal appearance.
She had to walk out on that stage that held about 4,000 people, I think, at the Palladium, and she wasn't to know how they were going to take to her, what was going to happen to her. And she came out and she sang, "Take me to your heart again," you know, let everything be forgiven. And when she'd finished it, I don't think there was anybody that wasn't crying, and she had a standing ovation. And as I'm telling you now, it really still makes me go cold.
A belated peace was now restored between Gracie and the press. She did more concerts, made more records, but by the end of the 1940s, she decided to live permanently in Capri, where she and Monty built a restaurant and a swimming pool. In 1950, however, with this enterprise still incomplete, Monty Banks died of a heart attack. Gracie continued to work, perhaps harder than ever, and between engagements returned to Capri, where she struck up a friendship with Boris Alperovici, whom she first met when he came to repair her radio set.
I knew that she was interested in Boris. He was here for lunch most days, but she used to try and put him next to me, saying he's a good man. And one day I asked the maid, I said, "Dove è la signora?" Walking downstairs, and I looked, and they were the two of them swinging along hand in hand. I said,
nobody was knowing. We knew each other, right? We're good friends, right? And everything was like quite our intimate secret, right? Gracie was traveling. She was big star, very famous, right? I was just normal gray person living quietly in Capri. So I was bachelor. I have never been married before.
Well, who proposed to whom, then?
I will not say, but Gracie mentioned so much things when she put it in her book. Right? She proposed to me.
Boris became Gracie Fields' third husband in the Catholic Church in Capri in 1952, when he was 49 and she was 54. Thereafter, she decided to ease up on her working engagements. Her career had always been propelled more by others than by herself, and besides, Boris, who'd led a sheltered life on Capri, had very little conception of how enormously popular she was. On the other hand, he did have his own ideas about what he liked and did not like.
If Boris sees this, he won't like it. But he did interfere with her career and did try, I suppose he thought he was doing the right thing and tried to advise her on how she should do things and how she shouldn't. But I don't think he helped her.
She lost a lot of the fun in her through this because he didn't approve of her doing burlesquing comedy songs and things like that.
Sometimes we have different opinion of her program, right? May Lord forgive me, but I don't like it too much Walter or as pedestrian. There was not, I know, in this time was not my cup of tea.
The first time he went to a concert in England, went up to see it in England, I think it was in Leeds, and he came back to me and he was really astounded because he used to call me Lilky, actually. And he said, Lilky, I am very upset. He said, Gracie sang, Christopher Robin is saying his prayers. And you could have heard a pin drop in the theatre. It was absolutely fantastic. And he said, as she went to finish the song, the pianist moved his chair and made a noise. And she said to the audience, oh, excuse me, it's my tummy rolling. He said, I thought this was dreadful. This was dreadful. But I said, you know, Boris, that's what the people love. That is Gracie.
Her fans might, and indeed did, regret Gracie's perhaps premature semi-retirement to Capri, but her brother Tommy believed it was a wise move on her part.
As I could see it, her voice was getting a little tired and she couldn't reach the high notes they used to be able to. Her breath control was also going. In fact, I used to write to her and try and tell her not to do any more work because it was too much for her and she was getting nervous. And she was getting nervous because she knew she couldn't do the things that she used to be able to do.
She had no hobbies at all, which was a big mistake, of course, because when she wasn't in the theatre anymore, she just was bored and didn't know what to do with herself. So really, the people going to Capri so often and wanting to see her was a godsend in its way. You know, it filled a little gap. And she was quite happy doing it. It got very hard at times because when we were there and you saw this happening, 2 or 3 different lots of tours came down, and each time she'd get them all set up, you know, and say, well, come on, all get together there, and she'd sit in the middle and have a photograph taken, and then they'd say, well, sing us a song, Gracie. So she'd sing them a couple of songs, and it became a thing, you know, it was a performance, really.
Gracie Fields' stature on Capri was such that she was visited there by royalty, including King Farouk of Egypt, and he, having read the writing, or perhaps the hieroglyphics on the wall, asked whether he could stay with her if he should happen to be ejected from his throne.
Grace was taken aback by this, you know, and took it all with a pinch of salt. She said, well, yes, you got nowhere else to go. Yeah. Find room for you. Never thinking any more about it. Well, of course, a year later, he did abdicate. And suddenly one morning she looks through the window and there is this Arabian yacht coming towards her with King Farouk and his wife and all his henchmen and a lot. So, of course, she fixed them all up, and she wrote to me, and she said, he's very nice, he's a nice fat lad, and his wife's a very sweet woman and everything, but she said, he'll have to go. She said, you see, the trouble is, he wants the pool to himself. Nobody else has got to be there because he's still scared about getting shot or something like that. So he has all his henchmen round the pool, and he's the only fellow that's having a swim. Well, she said, I've got my clientele to think about. So she said, I can't have this. So she said, he'll have to go. And, of course, she told him. And eventually, of course, he went to Switzerland.
Do you think she was happy living on Capri?
I think she made herself happy. I think towards the end of her life she would have preferred to have lived in England. But I don't think Boris would like to have lived in England.
And she was very much influenced by what Boris wanted.
Well, yes, because I think she was fond of him, and, you know, I don't think she would like to have lived apart. I don't think Gracie liked to be without her husband. Gracie was a very dominating personality with practically everybody, apart from her menfolk. With the husbands, I mean, she allowed them to, I consider, dictate to her.
Put your shoes on, Lucy, don't you know you're in the city? Put your shoes on, Lucy, although it seems a pity.
During the 1950s and 1960s, Gracie continued part-time with her career, performing in concerts and at one period having her own series on BBC television.
Put your shoes on, Lucy, now you're here in old New York. You get by all righty if you let 'em hear you talk. All the city slickers love that southern drawl, so give 'em that humming child and have you all.
That performance, not perhaps one of her best, does at least illustrate her determination to keep up with the times. She was always trying new songs, and at one time she had more than 400 in her repertoire. In 1960, when she was 62, she was top of the hit parade with Around the World, And the following year, she was top again with Little Donkey. Not that she needed that kind of success anymore, because she was, in any event, a very rich woman.
Grace's investments have always been associated really and truthfully around property. And I think this is where her money has really come from, is because all her investments in property have done well.
I don't think she even realised how much she was worth. She didn't enjoy it. I mean, she would go on buses and do things that I would never have done, even when she had, you know, big parcels and things to carry. She said to me, oh, I don't like getting into taxis, sitting looking at the back of a driver. I'd rather get onto a bus and talk to the person next door to me.
Being with Gracie was like having an inoculation or being given a shot of oxygen about living. She was like a good punch in the shoulder and get in there and do things, and she lived. She didn't seem to be saying, oh, well, I wish I could have done this or done that. Everything that was on her plate, she just took it and dealt with.
Did she do things on the spur of the moment?
Yes, quite often she did. Quite often she did. I remember one time in Florida when we were there, when she was doing a show in one of the clubs there, we were walking along the street. All of a sudden, she sort of kicks up her heel and starts to dance and sing along the thing. She says, all right, you can go to the other side of the street. You don't have to know me if you don't want to.
You could never really arrange a dinner party for Gracie or a luncheon party for Gracie with various friends and people, because if you'd arranged it and on the way along she happened to see that some film was on that she hadn't seen, she'd think, oh, I haven't seen that, so she'd pop in and see it. And you'd be sitting there waiting, and it just wouldn't dawn on that, the amount of work that people had put in getting these things ready, and she couldn't really see that it mattered.
In 1970, Gracie returned to TV to begin an association with the programme Stars on Sunday, wherein she sang what she called her Sunday songs. From childhood onwards, she was and remained a very religious woman.
Every evening she prayed for at least for 1 solid hour. Every day she could be tired, she could be happy, this could be after the concert, could be after party, but she never forgot to pray.
On tour, I'd doze off to sleep and I'd wake up and she's still saying her prayers. She had a very, very deep religious sense and would always thank God for the voice he gave her.
Gracie Fields entered the last year of her life on a note, or rather several notes, of triumph. In February 1979, she became Dame Gracie Fields. But even before that, she'd opened a theatre named after her in Rochdale and made her final appearance as a surprise item at a Royal Variety Show.
At the end of the show, we'd all clustered on stage. We'd turned half left to bow to the Royal Box, and on came Gracie.
Sally, don't ever wander away from the alley and me. Sally, marry me, Sally. I've been singing a man's song all my life, and happy forever I'll be. When the skies are blue, you're beguiling, and when they're gray, you're still smiling, smiling. Come on, everybody. Sally, Sally,
Grace has had a wonderful life, a really wonderful life in many directions. I couldn't have wished for anything better. It's a terrible thing for me to say, for her end to be so sudden, because there wasn't really very much more. Her life was the theatre, everything in it.
In the late summer of 1979, Gracie was seriously ill with pneumonia. She left hospital earlier than was advisable, insisting in a letter to a friend that the old girl's back on her feet again, but not, alas, for long. Just after breakfast on September the 19th, 1979, at her home in Capri, the old girl died in her sleep. She was 81. An articulate resident of Rochdale, discovered by the Daily Telegraph, described her death as like having a bit of the old town knocked down. Gracie was not, however, buried in Rochdale. Instead, she was buried on a hillside in the non-Catholic cemetery at Capri, and the common touch prevailing till the end, her pallbearers were waiters from her restaurant. Gracie Fields was quite simply a phenomenon. She was a marvellous singer, an able comedienne, by no means a negligible actress, and a thorough, hard-working professional who never gave an audience short change. But all these things together aren't enough to explain the quite extraordinary hold she had on the affections of the public. What was it about her that made 500,000 people write to her when she was ill with cancer, that made the royal family send her get-well-soon messages, that made Parliament adjourn early simply so that its members could listen to her on the radio, and that, on one occasion, made a theatre audience carry her in triumph, shoulder high, down the whole length of the Strand? Well, this and future generations will probably never quite understand such an outpouring of adulation, because virtually all that's left of Gracie Fields, the performer, is on film, and film never really did her justice. When she died, the Guardian described her as the Rochdale mill girl, who was almost the exact double of Lady Churchill, but at the other end of the social scale. Well, maybe, but 500,000 people don't write to a Rochdale mill girl, no matter how much she might look like Lady Churchill. Somebody once defined the quality that makes a star as that little something extra. What Gracie had was that little something extra, and then a little something extra on top of that. Warmth, perhaps, humanity, talent, personality. Whatever it was, if you could bottle it and sell it, you could make a fortune overnight. And whatever it was, it helped to make Gracie Fields incomparably the most popular entertainer Britain ever had.
You've got to smile when you say goodbye. You've got to smile as the days go by. And all the time that you're away, I'm thinking of you. I'll write and say from day to day how much I love you. You've got to smile when you say goodbye. You've got to smile till the clouds roll by. So till we meet again, say cheerio and give me a smile when you say goodbye.
Sing as we go.